There's lots left to do as lawmakers head into the last week of session. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Good evening, and thank you for tuning into this week's edition of Capitol View, the show where we talk about Illinois politics and government. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and with me this week is Charlie Wheeler, Director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at UIS. Charlie, thank you for being here.
It's always good to be here, Jamie. Thank you.
And longtime Statehouse watcher Mike Lawrence. Mike, thanks for being here.
Good to be here.
I want to thank you both for being here on our special close to adjournment edition. We have a lot of things to talk about, but I kind of want to rewind a little bit to last week. After the show was taped last week, the Senate passed the medical marijuana bill, so we want to chat about that a little bit, and then we'll move ahead to some of the things that we're going to see coming forward next week. So Charlie, this is something that you've watched for a while. You've written some columns about it. What's your take on why this was the time for medical marijuana to happen in the legislature?
Well, I think part of it is that there is a growing recognition among the general public that allowing folks with serious medical conditions who can't have their conditions eased by some of the standard pharmaceuticals, to allow them access to medical marijuana is not that bad a thing. The world's not going to come to end. There are a number of other states that have done it. As a matter of fact, last election, 2 states legalized marijuana to be used as alcohol for recreational purposes. And so and part of the impetus was some of the compelling testimony from people for whom this is a very real issue. People who have intense pain and find that smoking marijuana, 1 marijuana cigarette a day, allows them to do away with dozens and dozens and dozens of these prescription medicines that, as a matter of fact, are more dangerous and more addictive than cannabis. And so I think all these things are changing the attitudes of people, and because this bill is drafted in such a way that it is very tightly controlled, more so than other legislation that faltered in the past, some of the people who voted in the past against earlier plans supported this one specifically because of the stringent regulations within it.
Well, Governor Pat Quinn has not taken a stance on the bill yet. He said he's open-minded about it. Mike, from the executive standpoint, what sorts of things is he probably weighing now looking at this bill, and what can we maybe expect to see?
Well, if he's and his staff are given it a proper review, they'll make sure that the language is right and that there are no phrases that might be misconstrued and cause trouble. And he'll probably, he and his staff will probably give opponents a chance to make their case as well as the proponents. But in the end, it's probably going to be how he himself feels about it in his gut. This is one of those things where I don't think, I think the polls would probably indicate that most people at this point favor it. So if there's a question about the political fallout, he might, he would probably pay attention to that as well. Although I think this is a decision he's going to make in his gut. And Charlie was saying earlier before the program began that they had testimony in the legislative committee from veterans, and Governor Quinn is somebody who's very sensitive to the views and concerns of veterans, and there was pretty compelling testimony from a veteran about the pluses of using medical marijuana, and then I guess Governor Quinn met with this veteran afterwards as well. So that may help sway him in the direction of signing the bill. And you had pretty good majorities on this in the House and Senate. And as Charlie said, this bill is tightly drawn. In fact, many people have said, and staff people and others have said, Illinois' medical marijuana law would be one of the the most restrictive, if not the most restrictive in the nation.
It seems like some other states have given this a shot, tried it out. Some folks have not been pleased with things that have happened maybe in California or Colorado. People here in Illinois have pointed to those states as being maybe less restrictive. But Charlie, have those other states trying this out maybe given Illinois a path to either follow or to choose not to follow?
If I'm not
doing
mistaken,
this?
Senator Hayne, who sponsored the bill in the Senate, who is a former prosecuting attorney in Madison County, pointed out that California, in essence, screwed it up, and we're not California. For example, in California, you can grow your own. Here in Illinois, there's going to be 22 places that are allowed to grow it, one in each state police district. They're going to have security inside and outside 24/7. Everybody involved is going to have to get background checks, fingerprinted. It's going to be as tightly controlled as the CIA headquarters in Virginia. Then you could only buy it at 60 places, 60 dispensaries around the state, and they're also going to be totally, regulated, tightly controlled. Everybody gets background checks, fingerprints. You have to establish that you've had a relationship with this doctor, that you have one of this list of 36 very severe illnesses, and that the doctor believes for medical reasons that prescribing you a limited amount of marijuana is going to ease your pain. And I believe people are limited to 2.5 ounces, maybe a month, something like that. So it's not going to be kind of wild open where it's like, hey, I got a headache, I'm going to grow some pot in the basement with the lights on it. It's not going to be like that at all. And as a matter of fact, the evidence suggests that the kind of drugs that people are routinely given for pain are much more subject to abuse. If I'm not mistaken, no one has ever died from an overdose of marijuana, and yet one of the popular painkillers, OxyContin, has had overdoses that have resulted in death. It's abused. Vicodin is another. And so I don't see this as anything at all similar to what's going on in some of these other states. This is probably going to be more difficult to get a prescription for than it would be for me to go to my doctor and get a prescription for a painkiller.
It would seem that way. And Governor Pat Quinn has some time to consider this, so we'll all just have to keep an eye out for what's going to happen next. But I want to kind of fast forward now to this week. Concealed carry legislation came forward in the House. We're taping on Thursday, but on Friday, when you watch this, it may have passed the House. It's predicted to pass. Charlie, people are seeing this, or some people in the House anyway, as sort of a compromise bill. The NRA is neutral on it, but it seems like people in the Senate have their reservations. What's your take on this bill?
I think this is another situation that could lead to both chambers passing something and nothing actually getting to the governor. And I say that because the Senate, as you suggest, Jamey, is pretty cool to the notion that there should be one state law superseding all the local regulations. In particular, the County of Cook has a ban on assault weapons. The legislation as it now stands, it came out of a House committee, and it's at some point will be voted on by the full House, would preclude or override all those kinds of local ordinances. And I think that's a real concern in Cook County. I think there are also other differences. The House bill would allow local law enforcement to object. The Senate bill is stronger in terms of allowing local sheriffs, local police chiefs to say, no, this individual, he's maybe not been charged with a crime, but he's kind of, he's not quite all there. I don't think it's good for him to have a gun in public. And so those kinds of differences could lead to a situation, as I say, where nothing ultimately passes.
Under the House proposal, law enforcement officials could object, but there would be a panel that's appointed by the governor that would then kind of sign off. And Chicago wouldn't really have any further restrictions. They wouldn't be able to take it any further than any other area. Mike, that seems to be the deal breaker on this for both sides, is what do you do about Chicago? What do you do about Cook County? Is there even room for a middle ground on that
Well,
issue?
I think they need to find it. If they don't find it by June 9th, Illinois could be wide open, depending on what the federal appellate court does. The federal appellate court gave the legislature 6 months to get this resolved, and essentially it ruled that the current situation in Illinois, where you have a ban, is not appropriate, not legal. So if there is no resolution of this by June 9th, it's a totally unpredictable situation. And it seems to me that the responsible thing to do here is to compromise, and by the very nature of compromise, people on both sides need to give. And I think there is room for people to give on this.
And
I think another wrinkle that I find kind of fascinating is, supposing the legislature doesn't act, and on June 9th the hammer drops, the state's law banning concealed carry is out the window. Would that open the door for localities with home rule powers to impose their own regulations on concealed carry, as exists in a sense in Chicago and Cook County? I know the Springfield City Council, some of the aldermen are talking about, well, maybe if the legislature doesn't act, maybe we don't want that Wild West situation. Maybe we should impose some of our own. And so you could wind up with a totally chaotic situation.
And that seems to be what a lot of people feel. Senate President John Cullerton said last weekend that, well, it might not be the end of the world if we don't pass a bill, because the local home rule people could maybe set their own rules. But the NRA has vowed that if that happens, they're going to try to block those local rules. Mike, you look like you have something you want to say.
The NRA will block it. And also, I mean, you've got an untenable situation. Charlie just said chaotic. That's a good word for it. I mean, you're driving in one town, and concealed carry is severely restricted. The next town over is wide open. So it's we don't want that situation in Illinois. We want some uniformity. They may be able to work out something that does recognize differences between Chicago and downstate, but it seems to me like the Madigan approach is perhaps the most realistic approach, given where we are. And Charlie's made a reference here to wiping out local ordinances or superseding local ordinances that ban assault weapons. That particular aspect might be accommodated as the two chambers try to work something out. But it, in my mind, would be the height of irresponsibility. Not that we haven't seen plenty of irresponsibility over the last several years, to come to June 9th and have no resolution to this.
Well, and that was the one aspect of this bill that I think the folks of us that were covering it this morning had a little disconnect on, that it would wipe out the assault weapons ban in Chicago. Some other local ordinances that aren't really related to carry, that don't seem like they would interfere with it. So Charlie, do you think maybe that's a way, something being put out there that could be given away later as part of a compromise? It doesn't really seem necessary to the bill. Yeah,
I would say the appellate court didn't say anything about whether or not, for example, you could have ammunition magazines that had a high count. It didn't say anything about assault weapons. What it said was the U.S. Constitution, the Second Amendment, guarantees the right of people to bear arms. And bear doesn't mean have it in the closet at home. Bear means actually to have it on your person as you go about your daily business, subject to reasonable regulation. And so that's what was stricken down. And so I could see a lot of room for compromise in the sense of saying, okay, in Cook County you don't want assault weapons, we can live with that. Maybe we need a ban on high capacity magazines, we can live with that. That doesn't affect your right to concealed carry, and work out some arrangement like that, a compromise, instead of getting into what Mike and I both have said would be just a crazy situation where people wouldn't know as they travel an interstate through community, county to county, what's legal and what isn't.
And Mike, I think it was telling that we're seeing the NRA not taking a position. The the gun control groups, while one person did testify this morning, they definitely weren't as vocal as they have been in the past. So nobody really likes this, but no one's being really loud about it either. Mike, is that sometimes an indication that we're getting close to a compromise that people might deal with?
Yeah, yes, it is. In many ways, that's where you want to be on a controversial issue. where you have neither side, or sometimes there's more than two sides, but nobody's particularly happy with it, but nobody's particularly unhappy with it. And that is usually how you get these things resolved.
Yeah, and that's not to say the gun control folks, talking to them today, they're still working the issue, they're still lobbying. That's not to say they're not doing anything, but they seemed a little less adamant on this than they have on things in the past. And the NRA, of course, is being pretty quiet about it. So.
You know, one thing that's clear, regardless of exactly how this comes down, the state has got to do more in the area of enforcing laws that are on the books. We've had an instant check law in Illinois since the early 90s, and that calls for background checks, at least from gun dealers. And the state police now has a backlog. They're not processing FOID cards, firearm owner identification cards, in a timely manner. And that's because they're short of staff. It may have something to do with their computer capacity. Well, that's the kind of thing that needs to be cleaned up and moved forward and rectified. And the other matter, and I think there has been legislation, honestly, I don't know whether it's gotten all through the process, that would make it more specific. Oh, you know, as I recall this, it was actually, I think the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court sent word out to the courts that you need to notify, when you've had a mental health adjudication, you need to notify the state. There are very few places, very few counties, maybe 2 or 3 in the state, that are doing that notification, where the information on people who have been adjudicated is available in that central computer system that is supposed to be checked when they're doing background checks.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that the bill in the House would impose a fee of $150 to get one of these concealed carry permits, and the money is allocated. $120 would go into a fund for the state police, I imagine, to help them process this backlog, maybe get better data processing equipment. Another $20 would go into a fund to improve the reporting, exactly what you were talking about. Those local court clerks send the information on these people who've been deemed to be a danger to themselves or others, send it into the central database. And then there's also, I believe, another $10 in there that would go to the state crime lab to help them process some of their backlog. So the people who are promoting this law, I think, are being very responsible in dealing with those issues that have made the FOIA card a problem in the past.
And that seems to be a priority for the sponsor in the House, Brandon Phelps. He has said over and over again that they need to work on that system, and that one bad actor could really ruin carry for everyone, and that, you know, we really need to take a look at that system. So that's something that looks like, if this gets through, could possibly improve in the future. So while all of these issues are going on, the chambers are also trying to work out their budgets. We're looking at an adjournment date set for a week from, if you're watching this show on Friday, a week from today. And a lot of this is going on behind closed doors. We haven't seen any open budget hearings recently. But Charlie, what are you hearing about the budget, and what do you expect to see?
I expect that there will be some agreement reached in time for the legislature to adjourn on May 31st. And the difference, because Democrats have total control, the Republicans aren't really going to be a part of it, but the difference is going to be between the Senate and the House. The House is going to want to be more frugal than the Senate. That's been the history in recent years, particularly on things like education. I think one of the areas that's going to be problematic, Governor Quinn proposed cutting back on education pretty severely. And he also is under an order from a court that says he has to pay back wages to union members. It was a dispute over whether or not they were going to get contracted raises. And ultimately the court said, yes, it's part of the contract. It's an obligation. You have to pay it. And so the governor wants that money to be appropriated to pay these back wages, and the sense in the House seems to be, no, you got yourself into that bind. We think education is more important than paying back salary to people. You can put the back wages on the same stack of the other $3 or $4 billion in unpaid bills that we have now. So I think that's an area that's difficult. One of the things that we haven't talked about that strikes me as being a perilous path, but one that would be very appealing. Both chambers are considering changes to the pensions. The idea is we have an unfunded liability of $97 billion, give or take. It varies, I guess, from day to day. And to reduce that liability, both chambers are working on plans. They're kind of conflicting, but the object is to reduce benefits in the future so we don't have to pay as much. And what I say is perilous is we could pass a plan and say, okay, we no longer have $97 billion of unfunded liability. We only have $67 billion. Therefore, we don't have to set aside not that much money. Therefore, that frees up this pot of money that we could spend right now. And the estimates have been anywhere, they've been as high as $1 billion that the Madigan plan would allow us not to put into the pensions this year. To me, the danger of that is that whatever pension plan goes forward is going to be challenged in court. And if you take these, what you hope will be savings, and put them into your spending base, and then the court says, Constitution says you can't do that, you are really totally up a creek.
Well, and so far, Cullerton and Madigan have said they don't want to do that, but you never know in this last week when we start seeing the cuts for real and they start scaring everyone, something like that could eventually emerge, even though they've said they would prefer not to do that.
Yeah, but when they talk about, there's this money that's going to be saved, there are some lawmakers out there who feel it's very important that we have more money for education, that we have more money for human services. As a matter of fact, the head of the Medicaid program, Julie Hamos, got soundly criticized by a couple of minority lawmakers, senators from Chicago, for being basically a heartless Grinch, the Wicked Witch of the West or whatever, or the East. I'm not on Oz, but in any event, for the kind of cut she's made to try and rein in Medicaid costs. They say this is causing terrible harm in their communities.
But to be fair, the lawmakers approved those cuts. The folks that are saying this did not. The folks that are saying this generally voted against the cuts and very much opposed them.
But one of those people is Senator Donnie Trotter, a Chicago Democrat, who is one of the lead budget makers in the Senate on the Democratic side. So his take on things would carry some weight.
Very much so. But the cuts that are going through on Medicaid were approved by the lawmakers, although there's a lot of leeway in how they can be implemented, and it seems that they're unhappy with the way that she is implementing these cuts.
Yeah, and
she doesn't have an easy job.
Oh, no.
These are significant cuts, and there is pain, and there will be pain when you're making those kind of cuts. But the fact of the matter is, the legislature and the governor overspent, and they've overspent now for several years. And to try to get things back into line, or at least take steps to get things back into line, you got to go at some of those areas of the budget. And I really think it's somewhat disingenuous for even those who voted against those cuts to be raking her over the coals, because she's implementing something that the legislature basically and the governor told her to implement.
And kind of the ironic thing is she's also getting criticism from the Republicans who say that she hasn't done enough to purge the rolls of these people who aren't entitled to benefits and are getting them. So as Mike said, it's a thankless job. I used to say the one job in state government I would never ever want would be head of DCFS, the Department of Children and Family Services, because if you goof up there, some little kid could die. Probably the second least desirable job is the one that Julie Hamos has. But she's a very competent, extremely capable individual. She's got a long tenure as a state lawmaker. She was someone I covered as an active reporter, as did Mike, and I have nothing but the utmost respect for her.
And she's hardly insensitive in this area.
No, not at all.
If you watched her record as a legislator, and even at the agency, she's somebody who cares about a lot of the people who are being impacted by the cuts, if not all of them. But I think it's fair to say that previous directors were not as rigorous in checking eligibility and taking other actions that would help assure that people who are receiving aid are eligible for that aid. And it's just a very tough thing. We went through it. I was part of the Edgar administration in the early 90s. And Governor Edgar did not run for office because he wanted to go in and cut Medicaid. But he got into office. There was a budget deficit. We thought it was horrific at the time. We hadn't seen anything yet, to borrow a phrase. And we ended up having to make decisions and set priorities and make cuts in Medicaid. And they were not the kind of cuts that were easy to make, and they sure were not made with any kind of delight or glee. But when you're trying to bring a budget back into line, those are the kind of things you have to do.
Well, and we're going to have to leave it at that. But I would like to thank my guests, Charlie Wheeler and Mike Lawrence, for being on the show today. And we'll just be watching for next week to see how all these things turn out. Please tune in to next week's edition of Capitol View for an update. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn, and thank you for tuning in.